The antique train's whistle blew and its bell rang at a ceremony at Promontory Summit in Utah, marking 150 years to the day in 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad was completed.
The Transcontinental Railroad was a tremendous feat of engineering, innovation, and manpower that was key to unleashing the economic prosperity of the United States for generations.
That's Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao speaking at the ceremony last month. And she did a much better job than John Volpe, the Transportation Secretary 50 years ago in 1969. At the 100th anniversary celebration, he famously asked, "Who else but Americans could have laid 10 miles of track in 12 hours?" Well, Mr. Secretary, the who else in this case would be the thousands of Chinese workers who risked life and limb to build the railroad. For much of the last 150 years, this enormous contribution by Chinese rail workers was almost erased from history through a combination of anti-immigrant sentiment and suspicion. Connie Young Yu from the Chinese Society of America spoke at the 150th anniversary ceremony. Her great-grandfather was one of the railway workers.
This history has been so ignored and neglected, and I've talked to fellow descendants here on this trip, and they're saying the same thing. We didn't grow up knowing this. We didn't ever have this sense of pride. We didn't know. In fact, the Chinese railroad workers didn't exist in the history books. So it's important to honor them, but also to show how an enterprise is done. That you need labor, you need immigrant labor, you need people who, have endurance and fortitude and maybe a common goal.
I'm Ali Nirani. This week on Only in America, we honor this extraordinary labor of love with a love story from the composer, lyricist, and actor Jason Ma and his musical Gold Mountain.
Till the track is hard, young blisters rise, sheep we lay the tracks, and midnight our backs. We pound the spikes and hard, nobody likes for sheep, building the central Pacific for one railroad. We climb the ridge, we build a bridge, we come to mountains, it will take fountains of blood and sweat to dig through, yet we build a railroad, we build a railroad, we build a railroad, we build a railroad. Chinamen build the Central Pacific Railroad.
The 1,776-mile-long First Transcontinental Railroad, originally called the Pacific Railroad, started construction in 1863 and was completed with the joining of the rails at Promontory Summit in Utah on May 10, 1869. The railroad connected the east and west coasts of the U.S. for the first time, a feat of engineering that shortened a perilous months-long journey into less than a week. Thousands of Chinese immigrants built the most dangerous sections of the railroad, alongside laborers from Ireland and other nations. Hundreds, possibly more than 1,000 Chinese workers died on the job, and for decades upon decades, their sacrifice went unrecognized. Jason Ma wanted to tell their story through his art. A son of Chinese immigrants, Jason was inspired to be an artist as a boy when his parents took him to see a chorus line. His award-winning career has included work on Broadway, off-Broadway, and around the world. Gold Mountain is the story of the Chinese immigrants who built the Transcontinental Railroad. And as you'll hear, it's a story of why they came to the U.S., but more importantly, why they wanted to return to China. Our hero is a fuse runner, one of the workers who blasted through the tunnels of rock and then ran for their lives, in the toughest of railroad sections deep in the mountains of Nevada and Utah. For Jason, bringing to the theater a real-life story which changed the face of America is what his art is all about. Jason, thank you.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate this.
Happy to be here.
So before we start talking about the play, tell me a little about yourself. How do you find yourself not just in Washington D.C. today, but kind of doing what you do?
Well, I find myself in Washington, D.C. because my sister works with you, Jacinta.
Full disclosure right up
Yes.
front,
Yep.
No conflict of interest here.
No, none. What is interesting is, in this particular part of our lives, and I think probably in this part of our country's journey, we find ourselves very closely aligned in a way we've never found before. She is, a advocacy lawyer, and I'm an artist. And yet right now we are both weirdly in the business of amplifying the lives of our immigrant brethren and our immigrant history. So that's how I find myself here.
You're right. Jacinta is she's a lawyer. She's a lawyer's lawyer, an amazing advocate. But I've seen her artistic side too. But that's potentially a different podcast. So take a step back. Tell me about growing up and when you realized that you wanted to go into the arts.
I was 13. I had just won the school's math contest and was proclaimed the math champion of Malaga Cove Intermediate School. My parents, as a part of our education, like to take us to museums and cultural events and such, and they took us to see our first Broadway show. It was a tour of a chorus line that came through Los Angeles. And I remember how deeply that evening and that particular show resonated with me. And I like to glibly say that all the sort of synapses in my brain rewired themselves that night, because the following year, I started to have trouble with math.
What a coincidence.
Yes. And I also found myself enrolling in drama and really, digging into my music and choir. So that kind of changed my life. It changed the trajectory. Something woke up inside of me. So
how did you realize that? So you decided to cast aside a career as a mathematician. I guess what I'm getting at here is that, I'm always curious about people who are in the arts, how they, especially from an immigrant family, the journey that you and your family have taken, your family's taken, that decision to kind of say, okay, I'm not going to be a scientist. I'm not going to be a lawyer. How did you grapple with that? And how did you train yourself to be who you are?
Well, I did have to do some catching up because, that kind of decision came a little bit late in life as far as performing. And my first experience with that really was, in high school. At the time, it just was a passion and something I really wanted to do. Being the firstborn son of a Chinese immigrant family, it was a dual thing. One was there was a lot of expectation to succeed and also to make your parents' sacrifice worth it. But also being a firstborn male in our culture means that you get what you want. So I think in a way, I got to push my sort of position in the household to say, this is what I want to do. And there was a lot of back and forth. They were not on board for many, many years. But I think as they started to see me grow in that particular field and also start to achieve some success, it became okay. And that at that point, they were like, well, then get your degree and you can teach it when everything falls apart. And,
or now, start your own business, whatever.
Right. Start your own school, become a professor of theater. Now, when I look back, I just think, boy, they must have been terrified because they came from a world where everything was precarious. They had to leave their country under duress, really, and start over here with nothing. So they knew economic disaster. And they knew also that at the time, there were no actual opportunities to succeed or to make a legitimate living as a performing artist in this country. It's still hard, even though things have changed so much over the decades. And now, in a way, I can't believe that it worked out as well as it did.
So what was the first production that you did, whether you did it or you were an actor in it, participated in it, that you realized, okay, I made the right decision here?
I would say probably two big sort of landmark career moves. One was I got cast in the touring company of Cats in the 80s, quite soon after I graduated from college, and ended up performing at the same theater where that production of A Chorus Line.
Really?
Oh, yeah, at the Schubert, which is no longer around. And then I moved to New York and did some Broadway shows, and they were all not financially successful in and of themselves. But when I got into Miss Saigon, the original production, that also was a big signpost that, and I think at that point, my mom was definitely on board. Dad still waiting and watching.
So you've just done this play in Utah around the participation and the driving force of the Chinese community in building the Transcontinental Railroad. Before we get to the actual musical, what led you to this idea? What led you to wanting to tell this story?
I think it led itself to me. While I was in Miss Saigon, once the run was going for a while, up until this moment, I had been writing songs, but only songs. And it never occurred to me that I would be writing an entire musical. And I was just waiting to go on stage one summer, and a fragment of a song started to cycle in my head. And it was basically somebody comparing the mountains in China to the mountains in California, and how homesick the mountains in California made them because they just didn't look the same. They didn't feel the same. And this is odd. I didn't normally get, struck by an idea like this. And also there was no context. Usually you decide, I'm going to write a song about such and such, or I want to write a story about such and such. This was just basically out of the blue. All of a sudden, there's somebody in my head talking about mountains. So this actually kind of stuck with me. It wouldn't leave me alone. And after a while, it just kind of expanded. And I realized there are two people singing to each other about how homesick they were and that they were Chinese. And it had to be sometime long ago. And it was definitely California. And I just started writing. And, the song started to take shape. And I realized I need to go to library. This was not going to leave me alone. So I did some research and I thought, yeah, the railroad. This sounds right. And this song is actually pretty much intact. It's a little shorter than it was when I wrote it back.
This is Your Eyes?
When.
Yep.
And it's in the middle of the show. But somehow the middle of the show came to me first, and then I started doing research, and then we wrote it from the beginning to the middle to the end. And I never had this idea, I'm going to write a show about Chinese people, set during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It came to me. I've never had an experience like that since. Anytime I've set out to write, I've always had an idea of what it was going to be before I started to write. But this one came first.
When I look into your eyes, I see festivals on a river where the dragon boats sail by. I see mooncakes round and sweet, and we'll soon take mouths to eat. I see fireworks that light the nighttime skies when I look into your eyes.
Not bad. You're quite the
And that song is interesting because it's correct me if I'm wrong, obviously, but it's the love story, but it's also the love story in the context of the situation of these two key characters,
Yes.
right, around the industry of the railroad construction. Were you so, tell me about kind of building from that song in both directions, kind of like, building a railroad in both directions,
Yes.
right?
Oddly, the tunnel that they're constructing in the show was also built from two ends of the mountain towards the middle. I honestly, this story kind of presented itself to me. In a way, I felt like I was eavesdropping on something, which is, again, something I don't normally feel. David Henry Wong talks about how he wrote his play Dance on the Railroad, and how he would write and write and write and then do the research and say, "Oh, that fits." And I just recently heard that from him, and I thought that's exactly what happened to me. This story seems to call to you, and you write it down, and then you sort of backload the research into it and say, "Oh, that's about right. That seems right. This matches up with this particular event." So I don't know. It just came.
So the main character in the play is a fuse runner.
Yes.
And there's a line, I can't remember if it was him or the foreman who sings, "You will run your way back home."
Yes.
That stuck with me. Can you unpack that a little bit for me?
There's a narrative that our immigrant community is here to freeload, shall we say. To come here and enjoy the life of American people and to live off of our society. These people basically fled like incredible economic devastation. And their one thought was, how do I make enough money to ensure the survival of the family back home? And after that, how do I get back there? So, the character, he lights fuses and he runs as fast as he can away from the explosion out of the tunnel that they're building over and over again. He gets paid a little extra for this particularly dangerous job. And so he's running away from the explosion, but he's also running back to his home. He's running so that he can get back home. So I kind of love that sort of duality of running and also running towards your ultimate goal.
What is this job?
We need a man to be the fuse runner.
Fuse runner?
To build a tunnel, we must blast. You light the fuse, then you run fast to safety as the explosives blow. Don't be too slow.
Where the hell you go?
You're the fuse runner. Then you rest as we clear the rock. If we don't do our best, our pay they'll duck. But you're paid if you run or rest.
'Cause they know that you'll always do your best. Or in peace you'll rest as the fuse runner.
Run for your money, for your life, for your future sons and wife. You'll begin your journey home. Run, and you'll end the ceaseless strife of the railroad worker's life. You can run your way back home, back home.
How long is this fuse?
About 10 feet. You have a few seconds to get clear, then boom.
A big reason why it stuck
Why
with me is
can't you
because
just
even
use
as you're
more
talking to
fuse?
people now
Well,
who
fuse is
are
expensive
coming
and short
from
supply.
Mexico, Central America, et cetera, et cetera,
Cheap and
you know,
plentiful.
they didn't want to leave,
The fuse goes out when the
right?
north wind
Of course not.
Right.
Who wants to leave their home country where everybody they know is there and everybody speaks the same language they do to a country that doesn't want you, where you don't speak the language, where you'll be scrambling? I mean, it's an act of desperation.
Mm-hmm.
My own family, they were driven out by economic and political circumstances. And my mother's family came, they were a family of means in China. They didn't come here willingly. I think they came here because there was just no other place to go.
Mm-hmm.
And then my father's family, they came here due to economic devastation.
Mm-hmm. So and the play is Gold Mountain.
It is.
And you just at the 150th anniversary of the spike, the Golden Spike,
Mm-hmm.
you had a run in Utah.
Yes, we did.
How was it received in Utah?
It was received really well. One of the purposes of bringing us there was basically to reclaim history. The Chinese railroad worker history was kind of gradually diminished. I believe during the 50th anniversary in Ogden, there was a parade, and they even had some of the last surviving Chinese railroad workers in a prominent place in the parade. But I think with the backdrop of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, it was passed in 1882 and it was in law until 1943. So the railroad was completed in 1969. So that's less than 15 years. So there's this backlash after the railroad is completed because we have all this hardworking, cheap immigrant labor in the country, and they're not citizens. They're just leftover construction workers, basically. And there's a backlash, and we pass legislation that they cannot be citizens, and basically nobody gets to bring anybody else over. And so they're stuck here. They either have to just go home, or they have to find a way to be here and work under hostile circumstances.
And this is after the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yeah.
In that context, you return to Utah with the play.
So we're reclaiming history. We have, after Ogden, the 50th, we went to the 100th anniversary. By this point, we are well into the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we've actually passed it, but its effects are still there. The president of the Chinese Historical Society of America was invited to speak at the 100th anniversary.
This is 1969.
This is 1969. His name is Philip Choi. And to present a commemorative plaque honoring the Chinese participation in the building of the railroad. And we're talking about, by peak of construction, 90% of the labor force was Chinese migrant labor. But our place in the narrative at this point seemed to have been diminished or maybe even erased. I know that in my own school, we didn't learn about this. Not even, I hear that there's like basically a paragraph or two now, but there was not even a sentence in my history classes all the way through public school. So Philip Choi was scheduled to speak, and I believe either the night before or on the day of, he was bumped from the program with no explanation. And this really stuck in the craw of many, many Chinese Americans at the time. And in the reenactments that they have at Promontory, the trains come in and the reenactment actors recreate the champagne shot, and they also recreate the final celebration. But there's no mention of the Chinese railroad workers in that reenactment. There are no Asian actors playing Chinese railroad workers.
In the 1969, the 100th
yeah, and
anniversary,
actually, even in the last one I saw in 2018, there was no mention. That's just the script that's been going on at this site for decades and decades and decades of reenactments. So this year, there was a historian invited to speak. Her name is Connie Young Yu. And her parents are railroad descendants, as is she. And they were actually at that 100th anniversary and watched, as the Secretary of Transportation said something like, who else but Americans could lay 10 miles of track in one day? Who else but Americans could drill 10 tunnels to the hard granite of the Sierra Nevada? And of course, at that point, we're talking 90% of the force was actually Chinese migrant labor who were not Americans and who had no path to being Americans, but they were the ones who achieved these feats, but they were not mentioned at this 100th anniversary. So Connie Young Yu got to go up and speak and reclaim history. Part of what they wanted to do as well is include the Chinese in the arts and cultural components.
So the play was well received.
It was. Yeah. The Chinese Railroad Workers Descendants Association, which is one of the organizations that helped bring us there, their membership, there's definitely a large contingent of descendants. And they were so moved just to see, a Broadway-style musical that talked about their descendants, their forebears. And just the idea that an immigrant story could be told on stage. It sounds so it's hard to explain, but just seeing 10, 15 people on stage that look like you and are telling a story about your own history. I mean, that is, that's everyday Broadway to a lot of people, but to Asian people, that's a huge deal.
What about to the non-Asians in the audience?
Well, that was interesting because, we did do 2 shows in Ogden for primarily non-Asian audiences, and they loved it. I've been told in the past by commercial producers that it's a tough sell, that people don't necessarily feel ready to jump into the skin of people that don't look like them or that they have no actual relationship to, as far as, in their everyday lives or in their own lives. But I didn't find that to be the case. And, this was a test for us because we'd always done presentations of this piece on the coasts, on the East Coast or the West Coast, New York, LA, where people are more integrated with other cultures and people that don't look like themselves. But Ogden, I'm sure their Asian population is not huge, and they loved it. It was very touching to see that, to see how willing they were to be invested in this story. It has actually given me a lot of hope for this piece to continue to push it as a commercially viable piece. I've been thinking maybe this should just be sort of a niche, do it at the Asian American theaters across the country, but I'm thinking maybe not. It doesn't have to be that.
I kind of wonder if in the broader society with, just kind of the moment that we're in, that people are looking for places to go to kind of get out of the politics and understand our collective history, or each other's history, I should say, in a different way. I just wonder if there's a higher level of curiosity than we assume.
I think the world has changed in a very substantial way since I wrote the first draft of this, because
When did you write the first draft?
1994.
Yeah.
I've gotten to watch the world change in the way that the piece is perceived and received. Initially, I think there was some very sort of puzzled, semi-hostile reaction to this piece. The idea that somebody who looked like me would write this show. I remember a Broadway producer at the time, a very successful one, said to me, "This doesn't sound like you wrote it. This sounds like two white Jewish guys wrote it. Why would you write something like this? It doesn't even sound Chinese." And, you fast forward to now, and people who listen to it, for whatever reason, everybody has a new set of ears. There's a new context with which to receive the piece, and they hear it as this interesting hybrid of American, Chinese, and something even sort of fused together. And nobody questions why it sounds the way it does or why I would write such a thing. I've gotten to watch it gradually go from one extreme to sort of people are open to it. And I think people are curious about other worlds and other cultures. And that's a great thing.
So in that context, is there a particular song within the play that has become your new favorite, or a particular moment?
I still love our Chinese opera piece because it isn't really Chinese opera. I'd say it's more like sort of canto pop or something like that. It's this weird hybrid of sounds.
And which one is this called?
It's the second section of the opera, and it's called My Love.
The Weaver Maid and the Ox Keeper.
Over the years, the reaction to this particular part of the show has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think, honestly, people, thanks to the magic of the internet, have gotten to experience the sounds of other cultures and just have kind of retuned their ears as to what they're listening to.
So at the beginning of the conversation, to paraphrase, you said something about you and Jacinta, your sister, being kind of in a very similar place, right? I think bringing light to your families and the community story.
Yes.
What's next for you? You don't have to answer for Jacinta. But what's next in this journey to bring to light these stories?
After the election, this piece started to get a lot of attention. And I think I just have to keep riding that wave. People are indeed looking for stories that can enlighten us regarding the immigrant experience. What's interesting to me is that I feel like the immigrant experience and our immigrant history is everyone's. And I think that's why people respond to this particular show favorably, because yes, we jump into a world where it's like we don't have personal connection to it. I don't personally, because it just seems so incredible what those men had to go through. But you spend time with them and you get to know them and you fall in love with them and you start to root for them and you start to care for them. And by the end of the story, you maybe feel like you are personally invested in what happens to them. And, I think that's the journey. It's the journey of telling a story that creates empathy for people. They just happen to not look like you. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's all we need in the world right now, is this idea that we can just be a little bit more empathetic to each other.
Thank you. My last question for you is, name of the podcast is Only in America. So to finish this sentence of Only in America, ...
Only in America can the children of an illegal immigrant succeed as spectacularly as so many of us have. It is the American dream, and it is definitely possible. And we should be open to that continuing.
Really, really appreciate this.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you.
I hope it was okay.
Could have talked for like 4 hours.
Tonight's the night you rise to fame or fall flat on your face. Humiliate your family name or acquit yourself with grace. And something in the air just seems to whisper with delight. There's going to be a show tonight.
Jason Ma is a composer, lyricist, and actor. There is more about Jason's life and the story of Gold Mountain at our website, immigrationforum.org. And don't forget to leave a review of the show on iTunes or whichever podcast platform you use.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
That's our show this week. Only in America is produced by Emily Chow, Joanna Taylor, and Megan Wetmore. The executive producer is Kathleen Farrell. I'm Ali Nirani, and I can't sing and I can't dance, but I am going to leave you with a little more music from Gold Mountain. Talk to you again next week on Only in America.
I feel that their hearts are going to steal, you're going to shine.
He will be mine.
Oh, tonight's the night we've waited for. Relax, just catch your breath. A chance to do what we adore. It isn't life or death. It's just a little opera.
For the future I must find. There's going to be.
There's going to be. It's almost time.
Coming.
There's going to be.
A show tonight.